How's that? Hi guys. Hey Eric, hey Wiley, hey Monica, how you going? Brad, Floyd, Paul, Joel, and Jared, of course. Yeah, didn't have the receiver on. Hey Bryson, how you going? Unfortunately, this part of the thing is just going to be washed out because nothing I can do about it. Hey James, how we going? I can stand over here, I suppose. That might work. Aaron, Wayne, how are we? Hey Bobby. So, Sharpening, as we know, won the I'm waiting for the stream about the dog battle odds, fair enough. Hey Adam, how we going? So Sharpening won the vote by like 1%. I think it was like 35% to Sharpening and 34% to double bevel forging. So next year's stream will be forging double bevels because, you know, apparently a lot of people are interested in that too. The vroom vroom has not been fixed yet. No, I've been trying to source a rear windshield for it. They're no longer in production, so I got to go to wreckers, and a bunch of the wreckers have been kind of all over the place. So I still have yet to have my vroom vroom fixed. Hoping to get to that this week. Thankfully, I have the money thanks to the auction that I did, and also the auctions that so many others did to help me get that done. So. Not only will the windscreen be getting fixed at this point, but I'll actually be able to put it in for a service and get a bunch of mechanical issues, including the water pump, which is pretty much dead, fixed. So that's good news. It just means that I just don't have the time right now. So yeah, it's not a notification thing. If you go to my channel and then click community up the top, there's a little scrolling list. There's a little thing that says, you know, playlists, videos, that kind of thing. You go to the community tab, and in the community tab, I normally have my my polls. Yeah, water pump dead in WA is pretty common. Queenie Cowboy, how you going? My channel. So if you hit Sam Town's Bladesmith, like the little icon, it'll take you to my YouTube channel. And in the top of the channel, it's got the community tab. So, is this all like readable for you guys? Because the way I'm looking at it, it's mirrored in the camera, so I'm not sure if it's automatically flipping it. But hopefully, this says Sharpening 101 and not 101 Gning S. Yeah, cool. So it is mirroring it for me. Nice. All right. So 15 in so far. Might wait another minute and then we'll get started on the presentation. I kind of throw them up whenever, Joel. I try and throw them up directly after I do a live stream if I can. And Walk enters the chat. Hello, Will. How you going? So, yeah, I normally throw them up at the beginning of a week, normally. Most of the time, if it's a poll, it'll be about the live streams. If it's something else, like I post in my community tab for like updates and stuff like that as well. Thanks so much, James. I really appreciate that. Every share helps. So it's going to be going over the very basics of sharpening. So many of you will already know the very basics of sharpening, but I like to start from a foundation so that we understand where we're headed. Because there's no point in trying to establish prior learning in all of the people that are watching, because you guys will have had varied experience. Hey Tyler, how you going? hope you listened to the most recent Forgecast episode, man. We mentioned you. But yeah, so we're going to be starting from the basics. A quick question before you start: how do you get the right tension and friction folders? Carefully. And hello, Sagan. So yeah, with traditional friction folders, the method of tensioning is through the peening. So you basically are peening it shut more until it's finally sticks. I tend to, peen a little bit, peen a little bit, test until I get the right thing. If you want it to loosen, you put the rivet over a hole, like, the Pritchard anvil or just a hole in a piece of wood, and hit the pin like you're peening it. And what that does is actually force the pin through the material without compressing the pin, and that'll actually free it up a little bit. It's also useful for your tongs if your tongs are binding up. Giberon, Shamrock, how we going? You can listen to the Forgecast on iTunes and Spotify and Simplecast and all that kind of stuff. If you look up the Forgecast, you'll find the playlists and stuff like that of all of the Forgecast episodes. We're coming up on our 100th episode. The most common way to listen to it is on Spotify, which is an app you can download. Get Spotify as well. If you want to download the audio files to listen to when you're not hooked up to the internet, the best way will be to go to iTunes. There you go. Jared just shared the link. Do I use belt stones or paper wheels? Well, we're going to be discussing various methods of sharpening today. So we're going to be talking about all of the different ways you can sharpen, the ways I prefer for things, because the thing is that I don't use one method for everything. I have varied methods depending on my desired results. So we'll be talking about a bunch of stuff. At the moment, we're just going to be talking about this, the theory of sharpening, and then we're actually going to go over and I'm going to show you a bunch of different methods that I utilize for sharpening. So we will get to that. This episode. So yeah, don't go away. Yeah, so I'm going to be discussing sharpening from the point of view of either a fresh blade that you've literally just finished, or resharpening an old blade. I have a couple of knives that I need to sharpen anyway, so I'm going to be showing you how I go about sharpening those today, and I'll use a couple of different methods on those to show you the different ways that I get different edges, and also on fresh blades that are just coming out of the forge. And my theory behind why I sharpen certain ways and all that kind of stuff. But let's get to the start, because we've got 20 people in the chat, 21 people in the chat. So hello and welcome to Sharpening 101. Hopefully you guys know who I am. If you don't, my name's on the channel. My name's Sam, and thank you very much for joining me. I'm a professional bladesmith, member of the ABS, member of the AKG, the Australian Knife Makers Guild, and I am an award-winning sharpening expert, which is a joke, kind of. I have won an award for my sharpening. It was kind of a meme. Anyway, that being said, I study mostly traditional. Keep it cutting out. Is everyone else cutting out? Is anyone else cutting out? Uh-oh. Is it audio cutouts or is it video cutouts? That's irritating. Come on, baby. Internet is a little spotty in this workshop, so you'll have to forgive me if it does drop out a little bit. I've moved you closer to the door in the hopes we'll get a little bit more of that Wi-Fi washing through the I need to get a Wi-Fi router here, but I need of an issue. Anyway, back to what I was saying. We're going to be discussing a whole bunch of different things, but one of the first things that you need to know about sharpening is that there are 4 main points to sharpening. Yeah, I think it's my internet, not your guys. It's all good. So there are 4 main points to sharpening, and actually there are basically only 3. The 4th, it is part of certain sharpening processes. Hey Zachary, how you going? But these 3 steps, and they're all in order, are the foundation of all sharpening. Doesn't matter what system you're using, you're always using these points. And the first point in any sharpening is to create a burr. So, creating a burr, otherwise known as apexing, or like making a wire edge, is Wiley has listened to me enough that he knows this. He knows this by the back of his hand. So, first step is create a burr. Now, when sharpening any material, you especially steel, it wouldn't work in ceramics, but we're not talking about ceramic blades today. In any steel blade, you will create a burr if you sharpen hard enough. A burr, for those people who aren't familiar with it, if you've ever ground a piece of steel and then you had that little, flappy bit that was attached to the corner, that is a burr. That is a wire edge. Yeah. Thanks, Will. Hey, Paul, how are you going? So yeah, first thing we need to do is create a burr. The reason we need to create a burr is because a burr is a signal that we have created the most tight apex that we possibly can on the edge, right? So what happens to create a burr is at the top, like that, and you create an apex. What will normally happen is that you'll end up over grinding one side or the other, but the material is clinging together. It's not, it's not a stone, it's not ceramic or anything like that. And so what ends up happening is that you actually end up forcing over a piece of the material, which is your wire edge. It's the material that will not remove, instead just gets pushed over by the abrasive that you're using. And that is a signal that right here at the apex, there is a perfect, true apex as close as you can given that abrasive, right? So what we're trying to do is create that burr to give ourselves the ability to identify that we have apex the blade, right? So create a burr. Best way to feel for a burr, you can look for one if you have really good eyesight or you're using very, very strong abrasives. But most of the time you're going to be feeling for a burr. And I'll show you what that looks like in a bit when we actually get to sharpening. But one of the best ways to do it is on the opposite side from the side that was in touch with a stone. You want to run your fingers across the edge or up the edge along the side of the blade, and you should be able to feel a ridge at the edge. And if that ridge is catching you, that's normally a good sign that you've got a burr. And so that's your first step in any sharpening with any system. You need to create a burr. Hi Rob, hi Ben, hi Tom. Okay. So, once we've created a burr, normally we're going to be using a fairly low grit. We're using a fairly coarse medium in order to create the burr, because the faster we can create the burr, the faster we can actually get it sharpened. So, once we've got the burr, we need to refine it. We need to refine the burr. Now, how do we refine the burr? Basically, the size of the burr, or the size of the wire edge, is exactly contemporary to the size of the grit or medium that you're using, right? So for instance, if we were to start with a 60 grit to create the burr and then went to 120 grit, you would find that the burr would go from quite wide to narrower, to about half the width. And so each grit we go down go up, I should say, in our sharpening is going to further refine the burr. But at this stage, the burr is still our way of measuring whether or not we have an edge. Right, so we need to create it, and then we need to refine it. Now, the refining step, normally the creating step is a single step. It's a single stone or a single belt or a single, whatever system we're using. You're normally using one item or one tool to create the burr. Refining the burr is a multi-stage system, right? Now you could have a two-stage system in which you've got one to create, one to refine, and I will show you my system for that. But the refining system normally requires a number of, steps. So you'll have a, 120 grit or 240 grit stone to create the burr. Then you'll go to a 400 and then 600 and then 1200 and then, your final polishing if you're doing a super mirror edge or something like that. But the refining the refining is still just refining that burr we created in step one. If we haven't done step one, you can't do step two, right? So you create it, refine it. Number three is the point at which we create sharpness, right? These two steps are required to create sharpness. What do you do if you can't create a burr? You can create a burr, and there is no such thing as not being able to create a burr. I will show you how to create a burr in a bit. But once you've created a burr, once you've refined the burr, you need to remove the burr. Now there are schools of thought that say that this step is unnecessary. I will argue that in a minute. I will be cleaning this off and showing you why these steps are important. But the removal of the burr, the thing is the wire edge is attached to a flat section, right? So no matter how well apexed you are in these two steps, that little burr is attached to a flat section, because if you break off the burr that you've created, just immediately broken off, the section that's broken off behind that burr is dull, right? It is flat. It may be jagged and may cut, but it's not going to be sharp. The difference between sharp and jagged we'll get into in a bit. So while a burr will cut, a good refined burr will cut. It'll feel very sharp, especially if you've gone to a very high grit. A very well refined burr, because it's a wire edge, because it's very narrow and very thin, you will feel like it'll cut really well, but that is a very, very weak edge, because remember, it is literally just a little wire at the end of your blade. And that wire will break off quite easily, right? So when we've got a wire edge, we want to remove it in the third stage. Now, burr removal happens in a bunch of different ways, and that's why the fourth step is sometimes inside the third step. It really does depend. But the fourth step, which, again, is kind of part of the third step, is to hone. Hey, Curtis. So yeah, we have burr created, burr refined, burr removed, and then we hone the remaining material. Now, honing, unlike sharpening, it's sometimes used interchangeably by some people, but realistically, it is a step all of its own. Honing is realigning or refining the material that has been left behind by the broken off burr. Yeah, thanks very much, James. But yeah, so basically those are the 4 main steps to any sharpening system, right? Doesn't matter what system you're using, whether it's jigged or if it's it's grinder, or if it's a paper wheel, or if it's stones, or it's a brick. Doesn't matter. At the end of the day, you are going to follow these 4 steps in order to attain sharpness. Sanding is not honing. Honing normally doesn't remove material, right? So honing is no material removal. Yes, so stropping would be considered honing. There is honing that you can do. Hey Jeff, how you going? There is honing you can do with stones and stuff like that. I will show you a system. So sanding, if you were going to sand, if you're removing material, normally you're trying to either create a burr or refine a burr, right? So it will depend on the grit and the medium that you're using. But basically, in any medium, these are the 4 steps you're going to follow. Is that pretty easy to understand? Create it, refine it, remove it, and then hone it. Right? And normally, a lot of the time, the honing step will be contained within the removing section. And I'll show you how that works in a bit. But we're all pretty much on board. I'll get to that in a bit, Jared. We're just talking about the foundations at the moment. We're just establishing the idea of what sharpening is, right? So it doesn't matter what medium or technique or anything like that you use. At the end of the day, if you're not following these 4 steps, you're not getting a sharp blade. It doesn't matter how you go about it. Okay, so I'm going to assume that you all understand that. If you don't, or if you need to take notes or something like that, I would suggest coming back to the video on demand when it's finished, and you'll be able to watch back, pause it, take notes. Taking notes is important. But if you remember nothing else from this class, just remember those 4 steps, or even just the first 3. Create a burr, refine a burr, remove the burr. All right? As if you don't take anything else away from this class today, those are the 3 things I want you to remember. And this is how I won Kyle Royer's Damascus billet at Blade Symposium. Which I have sitting over there, funnily enough. So, no 42-part series. I have not figured out what I'm going to do with it yet. It's going to sit on my shelf until I'm, confident enough. Okay, so creating a micro bevel is a totally different thing. So, when it comes to sharpening, in all situations, you're going to have a blade that is dull, right? So you may have a blade that is brand new and it's square like that. Or you may have a blade that has been used and has been rounded out, right? In both of these situations, the approach is exactly the same, right? There's no difference in the approach to either of these blades. There is even no different approach to a blade that has, like if we're looking along the side of a knife, right? It doesn't matter if there's a chip in it or a gouge. At the end of the day, if there are, then we're still approaching it like this. Right, those chip sections are just rounded or flat sections. Right, if that makes any sense. And so when establishing a burr, we want to take that square section. We're not talking about geometries on blades today. That was an entirely different subject. Sharpening is actually separate to geometry, and it's you can have a sharp blade that has terrible geometry, and you can also have a really good, a blade with great geometry that's also not sharp. But we're going to take that blade, and for demonstration purposes, I'm going to make this quite obtuse. We're going to make a burr. Right, I'm going to create a little wire edge. Now, I'm going to accent it a little bit more. In a rough grit, it's going to be quite a large burr. But at this stage, we do not want to remove it because that is our marker. That's what we're aiming for. When we come to sharpen it, when we come to refine the burr, that burr doesn't shrink. It's the refining it is kind of a misnomer. It's just the way I talk about it. But what actually happens is it breaks off in the refining process. And the next one is smaller. But the reason we leave the old burr on is so that we have that reference. See you later, Zach. Sorry, mate. You can catch up in the VOD. And then each step beyond that creates a smaller burr and a smaller burr and a smaller burr and so on and so forth until there is almost no burr. Right? We all together so far? We all with me? The 3 fundamentals of sharpening, or 4 if you want to be anal about it. Pretty basic, yeah? And this doesn't matter whether you're making a knife that's a cleaver or a knife that's a straight razor. This practice is exactly the same in all forms. Now, for steps 1, 2, and 3, there are varied levels of grit, right? Now, there is no hard and fast rule on what sharp is. Okay, so if I want to make a hunting knife, right? I'm going hunting. I want to, skin some animals, cut some meat. Do I want a 3000 grit edge on that? Do I want a mirror polished edge? No. Because the more refined the burr, the less aggressive the cut. Okay? So in a hunting knife, I'm quite happy with a 400 grit edge. Right, a 400 grit edge will give me good cutting capacity, and it'll give me a nice toothy edge to cut through that rough hide and all that hair that's in the way. Anything above 400 grit is just more work, right? The reason that I say that, now if I wanted a straight razor, I do not want a 400 grit edge. I want this thing as high of a grit as I can. I want that burr to be as refined as possible before honing. I probably want somewhere around 10 to 20,000 grit. Right? Now, difference between these two. I'll get to that in a bit. I'll get to that in a bit, Quenya. So, a tool should be fit for purpose in more ways than one. And sharpening is no different to any other form of preparation. See you later, Monica. Now, if I'm going to sharpen anything, I have step one, which we all remember by now. But in this case, I'm going to go treat it like it's a grit. Right? Now I'm going to say 120 grit. Okay? That is going to be my burr establishing grit for this argument. There are, you can start with pretty much any grit, and you can, like make a burr, create a burr with 6,000 grit. It just takes a long time. Normally, we're going to choose a relatively low grit. For this case, I'm choosing 120. It might be 400, it might be 600, it might be 1,000, doesn't matter. At the end of the day, this is our starting grit. Now, I want to refine the burr. Right, so I've got step two. And remember, this can be multiple steps. This is the stage where we gather the idea of how sharp the blade is going to be. Sharp, quote unquote. Now, if it's my hunting knife, 400 grit, that's it. 1, 2, done. We can move on to step three. If it's my straight razor, I gotta go from 400, I might be able to jump to 1,200. From 1,200, I might be able to jump to 2,000. From 2,000, I'm going to go to 6,000. From 6,000, I'm going to go to 10,000. And then from 10,000, I'm going to go to 20. Right, now, this isn't the standard grip progression you would do for like hand sanding, but remember you're sanding or you're abrading a very narrow piece of material, right? You're talking about very, very fine edge. So the contact, the surface contact is going to mean that you can remove material faster than you would if you were hand sanding a large blade. But that's still 7 steps before we get to step 3, right? Sharpening a straight razor takes ages, because remember that each progressive higher grit takes a little bit longer because it's removing less material. So when it comes to sharpening, if I wanted to, make my hunting knife this sharp, right? Cool. You can do it. Sure, go ahead. Hunting knives interact with bone, they interact with fur, they interact with the dust that's in the skin. It's actually one of the most abrasive materials that you come across with skins, is that you tend to cut into animals that have been rolling in the dirt, and they've got all kinds of clay and grit in their skin and in their hair, and that's what dulls the blade. Once it's dulled, right, you're not going back 1 grit. You're not going back 2 grits. You're going back to here, right? And Matt pointed out exactly what I would have said is 400 grit is a good working edge on a hunting knife, because I don't want to step through the other 6, right, steps if I'm out in the bush, right? I want to carry a single stone, which may have a rough and a smooth side, like an axe puck. This is actually the axe puck that I carry out in the field, and it sharpens my axes and my knives and everything while I'm out in the bush. Something small, something lightweight. And I can't afford the hour that it would take to get to 20,000 grit. Right? So while, people tell me all the time that they sharpen their hunting knife and stuff like that to ridiculously refined mirror bevels, right? I go, that's great. But the moment that it loses an edge, you're back to establishing or refining that edge, right? Now, it might be that once you've established a bevel, the 120 grit may go away, and step one would be your 400 grit, right? It's very rare that your step one is going to be 1200 grit, unless you've literally just dulled it a tiny bit. You can still establish a new burr on 1200 grit, but normally I'll step down to the lowest grit that I've got available. That axe puck, for instance, has a 240 grit side and a 800 grit side, right? That's the steps. 240, 800, that's it. But 400 will do the job. No, and that's not true, Will. So what would I go to 20K for? Well, there's straight razors, there are wood carving tools. Right, for wood carving tools, you want as little toothiness to your edge, because any artifact of the edge, right, is going to end up in the wood. Also, competition axes, competition choppers tend to be in this area, right? They tend to be, in competition, you want that little bit of extra cutting power that you're going to get out of a very refined edge. I'm talking about practical sharpness. Now, Jared pointed out that you can start with a mirror edge when you take it out there and then, resharpen it to 400 grit really quickly out in the field. Yes, you can, absolutely. What I'm arguing is that it's unnecessary in most cases. Yeah, pretty much, Will. It gives not only a smoother carving, but it also gives you a better finish off the tool. So all my planes, my spoke shave and all that kind of stuff are all sharpened to about 10,000 grit. And they're stropped quite heavily. And that means that I get pretty much close to as shiny as you'll get, off a tool. You can see reflections off the material if you're doing it right. So yeah, it overall gives you the finish. So when I sell my 52100 Sloyd carving knives, they're sold with a 10,000 grit edge. And they're designed specifically for whittling and wood carving, where basically you want the tool to be the finishing tool, right? Like, you don't want to have to go back and sand it. And so therefore the cuts should be super clean, and any artifact on that edge is going to end up on the piece. You'll notice that if you have a relatively rough edge, you cut a piece of wood, they'll see streaks or striations in the cut, and that's from the edge itself. But we're not talking about edge geometry at this point, we're talking about sharpness. Now, this isn't a hard and fast rule. Like, I'm not saying that you have to go to 400 grit on your hunting knife and, don't do any of this. I normally sharpen my hunting knives before I leave to about 2000 grit, right? And I give them a relatively refined edge. I still want a bit of toothiness on it because I still want to be able to make it through that hide, no problem. Mirror edges don't tend to cut that kind of stuff very well. But when I'm out in the field, I will settle for my 400 or my 800 grit stone when sharpening. The idea is that you don't want to be hung up on the idea of needing a 6,000, 10,000, 20,000 grit edge, right? What a lot of people will say is that, I can't sharpen my stuff in the field because I can't get it to, 10,000 grit. Sharpening does not require that you get it up to a mirror. And I will show you that you can shave with a 400 grit edge. Properly refined, properly honed. But we understand the basics, right? Grit progression is necessary in order to get high grit finishes, but isn't necessary for a lot of tools that we use on a day-to-day basis. Yeah? Cool. All right, so that pretty much covers most of the theory. Yep, 1000, 6000, that's actually one of the sets that I've got. Appleseed versus flat grind. That's an edge geometry. That's a bevel geometry question rather than a sharpness question. I'll take you over and I'll show you the sharpening setups that we're going to do. But basically, yeah, that's more of an edge geometry question than a sharpening question. Now, the last thing I'll touch on is something that we always hear about, which is my least favorite subject in sharpening. Angles. I hate this conversation. I hate this word in sharpening because it always starts arguments. There are a million people out there who will argue to the death over angles, right? I hate it with a passion. I absolutely hate this argument. While it's important, angles are important in sharpening, right? Because obviously, if we're 90 degrees to the plane of the blade, running it along the stone, we ain't gonna get sharp, okay? But my problem comes when we start arguing, 10 degrees inclusive, 50 degrees inclusive. There are varied edge angles for varied use. And I've always worked on the principle, and it's never done me wrong. The lower the better. Never done me wrong, right? Most of the time, we're talking about freehand sharpening, right? We're not talking about using a system. If you're using a system, then angles become a little bit more important. But in most situations, the lower, the better. Right, so when people talk about edge angles, so if someone says, a 10 degree bevel, are they talking inclusive or exclusive? Because a 10 degree inclusive means right? 5 degrees either side for 10 degrees inclusive. For a 10 degree exclusive, that is actually a 20 degree, and these are 10s. Does that make sense? Now, normally, when we start sharpening blades, we're going to be talking exclusive angles, right? So if I say sharpen to a 25 degree angle, I'm talking 25 degrees exclusive. Scandinavian grinds, traditionally, are 25 degrees aside, right? And that means that the angle inside is 50 degrees inclusive, and it's 25 degrees outside, right? So that angle there is 25 degrees. Yep, we'll get that in a minute, James, as well. But yeah, if someone's talking about edge angles, most of the time they're saying, if they say a 25 degree edge bevel, they're talking exclusive, unless they use the term inclusive. So if someone says 25 degrees inclusive, they mean 12.5 degrees per side. Most sharpening systems won't go below 15 degrees exclusive, right? Most sharpening systems that I know of, TS Prof, GRS, not GRS, the other ones, whatever, will have an included angle of 30 degrees minimum. Like, that's as low as they'll go. One of the disadvantages of the systems that do this comes when the honing step comes in, which I'll get to in a minute. But a 30-degree inclusive angle is normally the lowest that you'll go on most items. Right, the average for all general purpose tooling, right, you can get a usable, workable edge, and this is where I start in the argument between sharpness and edge geometry. Sharpness is the very apex, right? It has nothing to do with the geometry of the material behind it. It is just the apex. Okay, a blade's sharpness is not determined by its thickness. You can have a 10 millimeter thick bar with literally just two 25-degree angles cut on it, and it will be just as sharp as the blade that is a millimeter thin and has 25-degree edge bevels on it, right? Doesn't matter the thickness, the sharpness is determined by the apex. The cutting geometry is determined by the, overall bevels and stuff like that on the blade, right? So this knife is just as sharp as this knife, right? This knife is sharper than that knife, right? Even though this is thinner and would technically be better edge geometry because it's, narrow, this knife is sharper because it's actually got an edge. So, don't get it too mixed up. Sharpness is not cutting geometry. Sharpness is not cutting ability. When it comes to angles, the universal standard for the included angle is 45 degrees. Yes, that's correct. Well, sharpness is the ability to start the cut. The geometry is what decides whether or not it'll cut well. Oh, geez, thank you so much, Black Collar Ironworks. I really appreciate that, man. Wow. Jesus. All right, well, thank you. That's amazing, guys. Yes, lots of applause. For Black Collar Ironworks here. Thank you so much. We'll just take a moment to appreciate that. That's huge, man. Wow. Okay, so your average included angle. That's all right, Quenya. That's quite all right. I don't require people to pay me. I have some very, very generous people who do through my Patreon and stuff like that. I greatly appreciate it. And then we have people like Black Collar Ironworks. This episode, this whole sharpening lesson has been sponsored by Black Collar Ironworks. Go check his channel out. Now, 45 degrees is the overall, standard, right? This is the general standard, and this is the one by which most people measure their abilities to sharpen, right? It's 25 degrees per side, or 22.5 degrees per side, 45 degree included angle. So when it comes to most cutting tasks, if you aim for 22.5 degrees on the outside and 45 degrees included, then you're going to get a decent edge, right? You're going to get a decent cutting edge. And 22.5 degrees is a lot higher than you think it is. I normally stick to about 20, maybe a little less. My included angles tend to be about 40 degrees, 35. The thing is that I don't use sharpening systems. I don't use jigs. So in jigs, you'd set to 22.5 or you'd set to 22 or 20, you know, therefore, you know, all that kind of stuff. All right, so now that we've established that angles are a thing and that we can ignore them now, hopefully. How's it going, Rob? Anyone should be able to eyeball 22.5, and I'll show you how. But let's move over to the anvil, where I have the rest of the class today. This class may end up going a little longer than I expected. I rambled on a little too long. Okay, so I have a couple of sharpening systems here, or a couple of sharpening mediums here. And Quenya, I believe, mentioned Kingstones. 1,000, 6,000 grit King. These are my favorite sharpening stones. They've been soaking because I'm planning on using them. But you don't need a $200 set of stones in order to get a good edge. One of the big misconceptions about sharpening is that there is some miracle cure to sharpness. There is some miracle, you know, material that's going to help you make your blades sharper. That's not the case. It is all about technique, right? I can sharpen with any of those, and provided they're of a similar grit, I can apply just as good an edge with any of these as I can with my Kingstones. See you later, Kenny. So right here I have a cheap $20 sharpening stone from my local hardware store. It's a 240 grit and 800 grit, you know, workshop stone. This one stays in the workshop for don't use that. Oh God, don't do that. Pull-through sharpeners are a travesty, and they should be thrown away. But anyway, yeah. So this is like one of those cheapy stones you get at your local hardware store, and this one I use a lot because I use it on all of my shop knives. Right, this is the one that I reach for when I'm sharpening my shop knives, or my draw knife. The ones that I don't need to keep super sharp. Because it's cheap and it works. I showed you my axe puck before, 240 grit, 800 grit stone. This one stays with me pretty much everywhere I am, whether I'm in the workshop or I'm outside or I'm, you know, anywhere. It fits in my pocket, it's easy to use, it cups in the hand quite nicely, and I can sharpen pretty much anything with it, including swords and axes and all that kind of thing. That one I'll get to in a second. We have two different kinds of diamond stone. This is an easy, it's a D-plate, it's a diamond plate. Trying to think of the word. It's a DMT, that's right, it's a DMT diamond stone. These are the most expensive stones on the market as far as diamond stones are concerned, and there's a reason for that. It's because they are precision ground flat, right? So they're precision ground flat from the factory before they're then diamond coated. And then I have a really cheap 600, 1200 combo diamond stone that I bought from eBay for 30 bucks. And guess what? Both of them cut material. Both of them have grit in them. So, at the end of the day, neither does a better job, but this is perfectly flat. For my engraving tools, this is why I have a DMT diamond stone, is so that I do my engraving tools, and this is the extra fine. This is the finest they have. It's probably equivalent to about 2,000 or 2,500 grit. And I use that for my engraving chisels because it's, very handy for having a very high polish on your chisels. DMT make amazing stones, and if you're going to get diamond stones, I would highly suggest them. But at the end of the day, a $30 rip-off easy lap stone from eBay will give you just as good results, just not as fine results if you don't have the extra fine. But 1,200 grit is quite a high grit. And then this stone, which I pulled off the anvil earlier, is actually a 10,000 grit Dover slate. Right, so I actually have a 10,000 and a 20,000. The 20,000 is purple. I didn't bring it out because I'm not going to use it. But yeah, the Dover slates, I use them for razor honing, and I also use them for polishing or burnishing my engraving chisels. But yeah, you can buy these as razor hones on eBay and stuff like that. But yeah, this stuff will sharpen to a very, very fine grit. But you need to be at a fine grit before you start with that. And then finally, we have a leather strop. This one's actually my little in-house strop for when I'm in the cold work room, for stropping my marking knives and stuff like that when I'm doing marking artwork, and also for stropping my pocket knives, which is why it's quite thin. And it's just veg tan leather on a piece of white oak. And that thing has seen me through many times. I actually broke my old strop that was in this workshop, so I need to make a new one. But basically, leather and a backer. And the thinner the leather, the better. Normally, I use kangaroo hide. That's veg tan, which is a little soft for what I need it for, but, you get away with it. Now, those are not the only things you can sharpen with. What else can you sharpen with? Well, there's a piece of random sandpaper. I can sharpen with that. I can sharpen with the bottom of a cup, bottom of a teacup or a coffee cup. You can sharpen with a brick. You can sharpen with anything that will abrade material, including my 2x72 grinder, which is over there. Right? Yep, you can sharpen with the floor, you can sharpen with a rusty piece of steel, you can sharpen with a piece of wood with some dirt rubbed into it. The edge of a car window is really good for honing, not so much good for sharpening. It works in prison, don't ask. You can hone with the edge of your car window. It doesn't really remove material. It's good for honing though. Acts much like a steel. But you can sharpen with anything that'll braid material. When I won the Blade Symposium Kyle Royer Explosion Patent Damascus competition, which has been gathering rust, right? But, that's the prize I won. I literally used a bit of broken belt, right, off a grinder, a piece of 320 grit sandpaper, and a block of wood with some satanite rubbed into it. And I got less than 300 BESS on the test. Sharp knives in a coal bottle? Yep. Anything that's harder than the material you're trying to abrade. But let's put some technique into action. Now I'm going to use my anvil as my sharpening station. And I'm going to be using my king stones at this point. A wetted rag, towel, something like that stops slipping of the piece a little bit more than just sitting the thing on a thing. And we have this cheap Wüsthof kitchen knife. I say cheap, wood stuff isn't that cheap. But just to make sure that we're definitely not sharp, you may want to look away. It was running really slow. There was no sparks. Now, when using water stones, one of the first things you need to do is keep it flushed. Something I wanted to address in this episode on sharpening. Get out of the way. I hear this so often that it drives me mental. And I've heard it from people who are professional sharpeners, people who are, master sharpeners, right? And what I hear from them, and what you will hear from them, and perhaps what you've heard and believe, is that it's the slurry that does the cutting. And I'm here to tell you that's complete bollocks. And I will go to my grave arguing this point, right? The slurry does not do the cutting. The stone does the cutting. What the slurry does is tell you that you are freeing up the swarf from the surface, right? So this stone, I'm going to dry this stone slightly. This stone will cut. There is a black line there. This stone will cut even without water, right? And it's not the slurry that's doing the cutting. What the slurry will do is guarantee that when I start sharpening, that steel is breaking off small pieces of grit from the stone and is also trying to embed itself. Like, the steel is softer than the stone. So what the steel is trying to do is bury itself in the pores of the stone and gum it up, which is why I hate oil stones. Oil stones, unless you're keeping them really flush with oil, are always going to gum up, right? Because the steel is going to bury itself into the pores. What the water does, what the slurry does, quote unquote, is carrying away, it's lifting off that steel swarf and freeing up the grit below it in order to cut. So please, don't continue the bullshit of the slurry does the cutting. The slurry doesn't do the cutting. It can't do the cutting. The slurry can't cut. It's floating. Yeah, well, that's it. If you're using oil on a stone, unfortunately, basically, once you've used oil on a stone, you have to use oil on the stone. But at the end of the day, you're going to end up wanting to flush that quite a bit with some low viscosity, no hardening area, right? You don't want to want any kind of oil that hardens. So WD-40 is a bad idea. Sewing machine oil is actually one of the best. So Caitlin's here. Do you thin the secondary bevel? Maybe. It depends. It's not always necessary. Normally, if I'm sharpening a knife for someone else, I won't unless I have to, right? So in this case, this knife is still pretty much in its same geometry as it was when it was bought out of the factory, even though I've just recently taken a half a mil off the edge. But the cutting geometry is not going to change enough that I need to thin the material, especially because thinning the secondary bevel, there's a lot of meat that I have to remove there that's going to take a long time to do, right? So no, in most cases I won't, unless it is making a serious change to the cutting geometry. So we've got our water stone, we have water, we have our knife, which is blunt. Now how am I going to go about sharpening? Well, I practice the Murray-Carter form of sharpening. Murray-Carter is a master bladesmith of the ABS. He's also a 17th generation Yoshimoto bladesmith, and he's done a lot of sharpening over the years. And a lot of the practical aspects of my sharpening technique are from him. And basically, the way Murray approaches sharpening is in sections. I'm going to lay the knife on the stone, and then I'm going to lift it. Now, how far do I lift it? What angle do we need? On trailing stroke only, Quenya. Only on the trailing stroke only. I'm getting there. Give me a minute. All right, so I'm going to apply pressure to the stone, and I'm going to lift the knife. Now, how high am I lifting it? If that is 90 degrees, right, then half of 90 degrees is 45, half of that is 22 and a half. Now, my normal rule for that is if half of 45 is 22 and a half, I want to go a little bit lower than 22 and a half. The reason for that is if I'm freehand sharpening, then my body is naturally going to rock the knife this way. Right? Not this extremely, obviously, but you're naturally going to improve, you're going to actually induce some rocking on the stone. And most of the time, you're going to end up rocking back and forth with the blade. And so if at here, closest to my body, is going to be the lowest, right? Then out here is going to be the highest. And you see how the angle has changed from there to there, because my hand rotates like that slightly. And it's almost impossible to stop. Right, like this is just natural human motion, right? So if I start lower than 22.5 here, then here I might be at 15, I might be at 10. But then out here, I'll be bang on 22.5. If I start at 22.5, here I'll be at 20, but then out here I'll be at 27, right? Which means that I'm actually getting a 27 degree edge. And this is where that whole convex versus flat argument comes in. The only way to get flat sharpening bevels is to sharpen with a jig. One of my favorite ways of measuring things is to get a coin. I don't have a coin handy. What do I do? What do I have that can act like a coin? This will act like a coin. It's 1 millimeter. So, the cutting disc. Lay the blade with the spine on the coin, all right? Normally a dime or a nickel, right, or a quarter. Lay it on the spine. And that gives you your edge angle, right? That's a very simple way to measure things. I don't care if I drop this too much. Yeah. But what I'm going to do is approach it in stages. I'm going to apply pressure to the edge, not to the spine, obviously. This hand is just guiding. And I'm going to stroke back and forth, but you'll notice that most of the pressure is on the away stroke. Why is that? Now, the reason that I'm doing it in the away stroke is that cutting into the stone can be useful, but imagine that this stone is actually a bunch of lumpy rocks, right? Imagine the stone is really, really jagged. If I were to drag the edge into those stones, I'd be hitting those stones along the way, smacking that edge with the stone, right? And so I'd be blunting it actively. Now, it's not true that that's going to happen here because the stone is quite, fine. But when it comes to finer grits, that can actually have an effect. And what also happens is that it pushes the burr further up and bends it a lot more. When you have an away stroke, you're stroking over those. Now, it still may be over that really rough surface, but at no point is the edge impacting any material. The other one is that if your angle is too extreme and it's already sharp, you may cut in to the edge of your stone on the push stroke. You'll never do that if you're pushing when you're on the away stroke. Now I'm going to do a section, the width of the stone or a little bit less each time. So I'm going to do about 10 strokes here. Right, and then I'm going to move down the blade. Next section. And then I'm going to do the next section. And then I'm going to do the final section. And on the tip, I'm going to rotate my hand like this. I'm going to follow that curve. Because the tip isn't straight. You know, you can't go straight back and forth. You have to angle things. Now, at that point, I should not have made a burr, because remember, this is quite dull. Now I'm going to start the other side. Now I can keep it in my right hand and simply work this way, or I can switch hands and start working on my left hand. With, you know, some people may not be able to do this. And there's actually a good case for it if you're using unstabilized woods. Because this hand, if you're doing this bevel first, is going to get wet and covered in dirt. This hand can stay dry, which means that if you're using an unstabilized wood and you're sharpening the blade for the first time, or, you know, the 10th time, you can keep the handle dry if you do just right-handed. But it makes it a little bit more difficult to find the angle on the second side. A 10-cent piece in Australia is about the same as a quarter, yeah. So, I'm going to do the same thing, working in sections. So I'm going to do 10 strokes here, 10 strokes here, 10 strokes here. Now on a longer blade you may need 4 sections, on a shorter one you may only need 2. And at this stage I'm going to feel for a burr. It's unlikely that I'm going to feel a burr at this point. Sorry. Am I shouting, or are we talking about Quenya? We'll get to that, Quenya. We'll get to that. So, and realistically, nothing. Honestly, nothing. Not much, because remember, this thing was just ground blunt. I shouldn't feel a burr, but to feel for a burr, I'm going to hold the knife like this, and I'm going to push my fingers this way. Now, I was just sharpening this side, which means that the wire edge should be here. So I'm going to push my fingers along there, and I'm feeling for a burr. I'm not running my fingers along the edge like this. I'm doing this. And what I should feel is that catch. Can't raise your hand in this class. Very true. But at the moment, I'm not feeling a burr because I did dull this quite a bit. So we're going to go back and we're going to do it again. Now I'll do this one right-handed just to show you how it's done. Try and use all sections of the stone. And now I'll feel for a burr again. Now this is a 1000 grit waterstone, which is actually technically more like a 600 grit in terms of the European grit, because the Japanese measure their grits a little different to us. But it's still quite fine, so it does take a little bit of time to establish a decent bevel using these systems. And that's why I don't prefer these for making fresh edges. I'll show you what I do for that in a bit. If the stone's moving around too much, just lock it down again. Now this is obviously going to change if you're doing a chisel ground blade. You wouldn't do even amount of strokes per side. But because this is a equally beveled blade, I need to make sure that I'm doing the same number of strokes per side to get an even central bevel. One of the ways that I cheated, I didn't really cheat in the sharpening competition with in Blade Symposium, but they just said you had to get it sharp. They didn't actually say that you had to get it equilateral. They weren't looking for edge central. So I just sharpened it like I would a chisel. I sharpened a single bevel. I'm starting to feel a burr now. So we'll go back and we're re-establishing that burr. Okay. So we've established a burr and I can feel it. Right, I'm feeling. See you later, Neil. Hi, Damascus. Sorry, mate, kind of in the middle of a class. So, now I've established a burr, I'm going to refine it. How do I refine it? Now, with a Kingstone set, you can actually start the refinement on the 1000 grit stone. You do stropping strokes, lightly, from the tip to the heel. From the tip to the heel. 4, 5. All right? At the same angle that you did the sharpening. And then we do the other side. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And I'm going to do one more, and then one more. And now I've centralized the burr. At this stage, you shouldn't be able to feel the burr on either side of the blade. But what we want to do now is test for grip. Now, most people will test sharpness by running their thumb along the side like this, or they'll kind of run their fingers across the edge like this. That doesn't actually tell you much. What I want you to try with a relatively sharp blade, thumb on the spine, 3 fingers on the edge, and just try and shift them sideways. Not aggressively, just try and shift them ever so slightly, right? I'm rocking my hand like this. And what I can feel is that the edge isn't allowing my fingers to slide, right? It's just grabbing them and holding onto them, right? If I pushed, then I would cut myself, right? That's what I'm feeling. I'm not running my fingers sideways, I'm literally running them down the blade. But instead of running them, I'm actually holding them in place and trying to shift them. And what's happening is that edge is grabbing onto the print in my fingers and refusing to let it go. It's refusing to let it leave. And what that means is that I'm purely apexed. Right? That feeling, that grab, is the best way to establish that you've apexed. So, we've established our burr, we've created our burr with our rough grit. Now in this case it's 1000 grit, or 600 grit technically because it's Japanese grit. But now we're going to refine the burr, and this is a 2-stage system. So, the next system is a 6000 grit stone. Or actually technically 3000 because it's just Japanese. Now you might want to clean your stone up a little bit. This one's been sitting in storage for a little while, so it's a little bit old, because I don't tend to use my water stones as much as I should. But again, what we're going to do is refine the burr. On this stone, we're not going to be doing push and pull strokes. Instead, we're going to be only stropping. And again, that's because Remember, if we're dragging into the stone, we're cutting the stone, and we're also potentially damaging that edge. So we're going to start from the tip. You can start from the heel. You know, you can heel to the tip. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Now, very important, something that a lot of people get wrong is when they come up to the tip, they actually go all the way to the tip. What you actually want to do is stop about 1 millimeter, 40 thousandths of an inch, just behind the tip, because actually what's happening is the stone is already contacting the tip at that point, and if you drag it all the way to the tip, you're actually going to roll your tip over. So I've done 6, that's 7, and now I'm going to do the same. Drag, stop just before the tip, stop just before the tip, stop just before the tip. I'm going to do that 6 times, and then I'm going to do it 5 times. Moderate pressure. That was 4, I think. That was 5. Okay. And then I'm going to do 1 and 2. 1 and 2, just lightly. Now we've refined the burr. How do we remove it? Now, most people will say go immediately to stropping, but actually that stropping doesn't always remove the burr. What we actually want to do is grab ourselves a piece of wood. I have a piece of chook house, chicken coop. Piece of wood, always handy. Sometimes I'll use the handle of my strop or just the desk. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to lay the edge in and I'm going to drag it through. Lay the edge in, drag it through. Lay the edge in, drag it through. Right, those 3 steps, and you notice that I did it in 3 different spots. You don't want to do it in the same spot, because when you tear that burr off, it's stuck in that cut. So if you go into that cut again, you're going to be running the edge over pieces of the hardened material. I didn't increase the angle. It may have looked like it, but no, I didn't. I tried not to, at least. It's sometimes unavoidable. But now we've broken the burr off, right? Or should have, considering it's a decent steel. Right? See how that gibber on? I've broken the burr off, and now there is that flat section behind where the burr was. Right? Because the burr was the sharp bit. And so I can actually feel that it is slightly duller than it was just a second ago. And so now I'm going to hone, and you can hone with the stone. That rhymes. But we want to go very lightly. This is very light. 1, 2. 1, 2. 1, 2. 1, 2. And that's it. That is now a shaving sharp kitchen knife. Made a file cutting chisel. Cool. All right, so, and as you can see, that's really nice and smooth. But that's all that's needed. It is now as sharp as it can get from that system. If I want to go one step further, I can strop it. In this case, it's unnecessary, but I'm going to do it anyway because, this is a sharpening explanation and not a... So, I have my strop. Now, if I lay this on the strop at the same angle that I was sharpening at, I might bring you back over to the whiteboard for a minute, or the chalkboard, I should say. Before I get to stropping, just quickly discuss something that is misunderstood in stropping. When you're sharpening a knife on a stone, right, the stone is unmoving, right? It is dead flat, it is unmoving, and so therefore it will establish only that. A strop normally it has give, right? So it will give around the material. So if we use the same angle here as we did on the stone, what ends up happening is that it rounds it up, right? It actually pushes the edge over. And given if you have cutting compound in your strop, that doesn't round it out, it just rounds the end. Right? And one of the big things about stropping is if you strop heavily on a piece and then do that little finger rubbing test, it'll feel like it has no edge anymore, right? Because it's rounded out. It's one of the things that the paper cutting test and the tomato cutting test will tell you. If you lay the knife on a tomato skin and just drag the edge across the tomato skin, no weight from your hand, if it's truly sharp, it will sink in. If it's been stropped to death, then it will shave hair, it will slice paper like nothing else, but it won't sink into that tomato skin because the edge isn't apexed anymore, it's rolled out. So what we want to do is, here's our blade, here's our edge. Instead of laying it at the same angle as the stone was, we actually want to go lower, right? There's a little gap here, but that gap is then filled by the give of the material, right? Which is where I was saying earlier about the sharpening systems, where they fall down, is on this step. If you decide to get like honing paddles for it with like leather on them, one of the biggest problems is if your bevel is at 15 degrees and then you strop at 15 degrees, you're going to round out that edge. See you later, Floyd. So what you actually want to do is strop at about 13 degrees, 12 degrees. Yes, it's one where everyone goes wrong with their stropping. On a straight razor, actually rounding out the edge isn't a bad thing because it prevents you from cutting your face, right? It helps with the shaving of the hair, but it like stops you from cutting your face. But in a knife where you want to cut wood, or if you want to cut anything else, rounding out that edge is bad, right? Now, over many strops, eventually it will round out. There's just no way to avoid it. But to prevent it, you want to go slightly lower on your angle than is acceptable in this case, right? There's a difference between sharp and sharp. Anyway, knowing that now, we can come back to the anvil. So, I have my strop, I have my knife, right? And I'm going to lay it slightly lower than I was sharpening, and I'm going to drag it across. Only ever away from the edge. I'm going to do 3, 4, 5, 6, and then I'm going to turn it over, and I'm going to go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and then I'm going to go 1, 2, 3, 4, and this is all with hand pressure. This is all with, a little bit, a moderate pressure. And now, to finally hone, I'm going to very lightly, I'm simply laying the knife on there. And that is as sharp as it's ever going to get. That is straight razor sharp. Like, I could shave with this quite easily. Right, like, I can, no problem. So yeah, it's one of those things where that is as sharp can be. And it's not a mirror edge, like it could be sharper. You know, I could take it to 20,000 grit, have it mirrored, have it all that kind of stuff, but just with those two stones and a little bit of stropping, I have it at a place where I'd be happy to shave my face with it. And I have shaved my face with a knife similar to this that I've sharpened in that method. It wasn't as comfortable as a well-honed straight razor that had been properly stropped and all that kind of stuff, but it's good. So that's one way to do it, but that was with $200 stones and, you know, the ability to brace it on something. Now I'm going to do it on the same thing on this knife, which is a slightly larger knife. I probably should have done it on the large knife on the smaller thing, but I'm going to blunt this out. See you later, Caitlin. Thanks for hanging out. I blunted it out with the grinder, and I got my axe puck. And I can dunk it in water. And I have my knife. Now, I'm going to act like I don't have the ability to brace this on a table or something like that, so it's not going to be as stable. And I'm going to do it by hand. Now, in this case, I'm not going to do this, because there's a chance I'll slice my hand open. With an axe puck or with a small handstone, you want to go in circles. But again, maintaining that same angle and working in stages. I'm working here now, and now I'm moving up to the center. Hopefully you can see that. Moving up the belly and moving up to the tip. I'm going down the length and up the length. And then we're going to dunk it a little bit more. And I'm going to flip it over and do the same thing. Yeah, I'll get to that, Quenya. It's the very last thing. But basically, there's nothing different. Now I'm going for about a 22.5 degree angle on this one, not the lower than that. So what I want to avoid is a lot of people will start sharpening like this and realize that it's going to take a while, and then end up lifting the blade to try and get it sharper faster. But the problem is that at the end of the day, that actually just makes it duller. Maintain your angle. Doesn't matter what angle you choose, maintain it. Now I could, if I felt like my coordination wasn't the best with the knife, I could hold the knife and orient the stone. That's also an option. I can run it straight down, or I can do circles. If I was sitting down, I could brace it in my lap. But you want to be very careful that you're not running your fingers into the edge, because that would have a bad ending. But I should be close to getting a bevel now. All right, let's see. Not quite. You can feel a couple places have grab, but a couple of them are sliding. And I can feel a burr in some spots, but not in others. So, back to the stone. And this is the 240 grit side. Sorry, I know this is the super interesting part of watching me rub a knife on a stone. Right, so now I've established a burr. Again, I can feel that burr. I'm running my fingers down the side of the blade, over the edge, feeling that burr all the way along. Now I'm going to refine it. But first, I'm going to straighten it. Blade on the stone, stropping stroke, 2, 3, 4, 5, just the weight of the blade. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 1, 2. All right, straighten that burr out. Now, the reason I straighten the burr out, I didn't say that in the earlier one, is because if the burr is over to one side and you end up putting that on the stone and starting to sharpen on the finer side, what ends up happening is that burr can get caught underneath the blade and actually, you know, kind of start rubbing the stone instead of the edge, and you don't actually do any sharpening, which can be a real pain in the butt. So make sure you straighten your burr before you go to the next grit. So now we're going to go to the next grit, the 800 grit side, and dunk it again. Now I've used this stone with oil a couple of times, which means that it's not holding onto the water very well. But again, in this case, we're not going to do stropping strokes like we did with the last one, because we've got a little bit more grit than the last grit did. So again, we're going to go in circles. And we're just chasing that same burr, that same line. Okay, I've refined the burr now, just by going along like that. So we're going to wet it again. And again, stropping strokes. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 1, 2. Get ourselves that piece of wood again. Remembering not to run our knife through the spot where we ran our knife through it before. 1, 2, 3. 3 is normally enough. And then finally, honing. 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2. And hopefully that's visible in the camera, but it does shave. Simple as that. Now again, I could refine that by taking it to a strop and making it a little bit finer. And one of my favorite sayings in the field is strop often, sharpen less, right? Because you can hone a blade, and it doesn't have to be stropping on a leather strop. You can strop on wood, you can strop on cardboard. Cardboard has clay particles in it, which is what turns it brown. And so cardboard will sharpen a knife, will strop a knife. Butcher's steels, smooth steels or pickled steels, don't do the ribbed ones. They're a massive bitch. So stropping is just simply the act of re-straightening that apex. Can you also explain the difference between Japanese and European grits again? Yeah, so European grits are measured by the square inch. Japanese grits are measured by mesh. They have a very specific mesh measurement that they use. Yes, that's why cardboard dulls the hell out of knives, is because it has clay particles in it. Actually, one of the things I used to do is, if I was cutting down cardboard, is that every time I'd cut cardboard a few times, then I'd strop it on the cardboard to get it sharp again. Yeah, aprons will work. The thing is that you want a hard backing as much as you can. Jerry Fist does strop on his hand, that's true. I don't know that that's overly effective. If your hand's covered in grit, then it might be effective. I know that he likes to strop on his hand. That's mostly for straightening the burr that he's created. But yeah, Jerry does pretty good work. I know that Jay Nielsen likes to strop on his jeans, on his knee. I've seen all different kinds of places to strop. But if you want an effective stropping, a hard backing is helpful. Not necessary, but helpful. Now, I could refine this even more and all that kind of stuff, but instead what I'm going to do is I'm going to blunt this again, and I'm going to show you how I establish a new bevel on a blade that I've just made. Seems like a lot of work to blunt it, but you know. Right. Establishing a new bevel. Now, I will say, if I'm establishing a new bevel on a blade with stones or with, you know, any kind of jig, that's the same method I would use. I use the same method whether it's been previously sharpened or not. But if I'm doing it at my workshop and I've, you know, just made a knife, I'm going to use my belt grinder because it's easy. Now this is a 240 grit belt. I'm going to run it at the lowest speed, which is about 700 surface feet per minute. And if I'm selling a knife, I prefer for it to have a strong but slightly convex edge. So I'm going to use the slack belt up here. Oh, thanks, Ben. So much. You guys are awesome. I really do appreciate that, guys. Thank you so much. So I'm going to use the slack belt, and I'm going to always have the edge running away from the direction of the belt travel. All right, so I don't want to cut into the belt, because that's a good way to hurt yourself. Ben has a good one, he's working on him, fair enough. So, 240 grit belt, and I'm going to run it lightly from heel to tip on one side, and then I'm going to have to put my back to you. And in this case, I'm actually using a lower edge angle than I would on a stone. Because remember, I'm creating a slight convex. And that means that the apex of the convex is actually going to be more obtuse than the base, right? Much like with the stropping. Again, from the heel. To the tip, making sure not to overheat. I do not want to overheat my blade. And I'm going to keep doing this until I get a burr, just like with sharpening on a stone. And if you're running it slow enough and you have a sharp belt, you shouldn't need to water quench your blades doing this. But if you feel it getting hot, do it, because the last thing you want is to ruin your knife. And you're very nearly there. Now, conversely, if you don't have this big slack belt at the top, the distance between the idler wheel and the platen is also slack. And so you can use that if you want to. Some people prefer that. It's a slightly tighter radius. I prefer the larger radius for finer geometry. And you don't want to be pushing hard, because the harder you push, the hotter it gets. And you definitely don't want to hold it in one place. And you want to work at it slowly, because it's really easy to create an edge dip. The edge will go whoop, like that, because it'll remove too much material. But now that's all sharp, it's all got a burr. So we'll go from the 240 grit. I normally go either 240 or 120, depending on how I'm feeling on the day, to a 400 grit. This is a Trizact, well, it's an A65, that's a 40 grit. That's a 240 grit. It's an A6, too fine. That's an A160. Oh, that's rough. Okay. That's an A10, A16, A30. That'll do. A30 is about an 800 grit. Gonna move this out of the way. And exactly the same practice, just but this won't take half as long, because I'm only polishing out the marks from the 240 grit, refining that burr. Sounds like a horror movie. Hey Alex, how you going? Okay, so we've refined the burr. Now, there are two ways to polish the burr. There are two ways to hone it. Yeah, whatever. On your horse. There are two ways to either remove the burr and hone at the same time, or remove the burr and hone. My big one is depending on how fast I want to finish it, and depending on how much it matters. On a fighting knife, I won't bother with removing the burr and honing. On a kitchen knife or a hunting knife, I will. So on a fighting knife, I will take it over to Mr. Grabby Throwy with some green cutting compound and a buffing wheel, and I will literally use it as a power strop. I will run edge down into the wheel, lower third, and I'll just run that across like that a couple of times, and it will remove the burr and polish it out at the same time. The big thing is that it will also round out that edge like we were talking about before, and so it won't be as slicey. It will cut really well, right? Like it'll cut 2x4s for days and still shave, and it'll shave hair, it'll slice paper, it'll do all that kind of stuff, but it won't slice tomatoes very well. But you're talking about a fighting knife or a Bowie knife. That's what I tend to do for my fighting knives and Bowie knives. For a kitchen knife like this, instead, I will do what I always do. I will remove the burr. 2, 3. And then I will hone it. Now, I can power hone because I have these. This is an Italian cotton belt. It is very thin, and it has a very light cotton coating on the outside. It's got a nylon inner and a cotton outside. And this works as a power strop. And these things are amazing. And if you want them and you're in Australia, then Rob at Weber Abrasives stocks them. But basically, this is like a leather belt that you would use on a belt grinder. Where's my green? There it is. In this case, you do not want to use it against the hard platen. But I'm just going to use the slack belt, give it a little bit of a load up with some green. I only know of the Australian dealers, Rob. I'm not sure whether that's, 100% better than the leather belt because it has almost no tap. Or, has little a tap than the leather belt and also doesn't stretch. See you later, Byron. But now I've removed the burr because I ran it through the wood. I can power hone. And again, remembering, I want to keep it lower than I did it with the sharpening. A leather belt will work just as well if you have one of those. They tend to stretch and harden. Oh, black collar, man, you're killing me. Thank you so much, man. I really do appreciate it. And we're just going to power hone both sides twice. From 800 grit with a green cutting compound, and we're going to get a relative mirror edge. And that is as sharp as you'll ever need anything. And if I feel like I need to re-hone it a little bit, I can always take it to my leather strop, my hand strop, and just strop it straight if I need to. Just stropping like this. Light pressure. But shouldn't be necessary with the power hone. And now that will be hair-poppingly sharp. So there you go. That is how I newly apex a fresh blade that's come out of the would I establish bevels on a stone? I have established bevels on a stone. If I was going to establish bevels on a stone, I'd start at a maximum of like 400 grit. Probably 240 would be my establishing grit. The big thing is the reason I use the belt grinder instead of the stones when I'm establishing new bevels is because A, it's cleaner, there's less likelihood of me slipping and scratching the finish, and B, it's faster, and I'm lazy. How you going, Ryan? Get a haircut and get a real job. Yeah, no, you first. So, yeah, it is, the fit and finish is the worst part of knife making, and definitely you don't want to get into it unless you like sitting down and doing lots of fit and finish work. But yeah, the only time I really use the belt grinder, the belts, I don't know actually what they're called. If Alex is still here, he might know. Rob at Weber Abrasives stocks them. You can you can call him and ask for the Italian cotton polishing belts. He stocks them. I'm not entirely sure what they are. I have two of them. I use one with green compound, one with white compound. But they are fantastic, and it leaves a very clean edge bevel. I'm not sure how well this is going to pick it up on the camera, but the differentiation of the line is looks very professional, which is why I like to do it. I don't like to do it on my normal using blades. I much prefer to sharpen my stuff by hand because I can get a much better result, much more controlled result. The belt grinder is just faster. If I'm just sharpening knives professionally, a lot of the time I'll establish with the belt grinder and then go to stones. Forging a blade is definitely fast compared to making a knife. Fair enough. Well, yeah, so, but basically, as you guys will have seen, or hopefully you will have seen, if I did my job right, is that every method that I just showed you is exactly the same 3 steps, just repeated over and over again in whatever medium. And I could have done this, and Alex has done this on his channel with a brick, talking about sharpening, and he sharpened with a brick. You can do it with a brick. You can do it with the bottom of a teacup. You can do it with a broken piece of plate. You can do, you can sharpen with pretty much anything that will cut steel. The big thing is knowing your 3 main points, right? A belt grinder is a great investment for a knife maker, absolutely. And for a blacksmith as well, it can be really useful. When it comes to sharpening, the best investment is your time, right? Is learning how it feels when you get the right angle, chasing that burr. And when I say chasing that burr, there was someone, I think it was Zachary, that said earlier, and he'll probably come back and watch this, that I can't get a burr. You can, you just need to spend more time at it. One of the big problems that I said earlier is that people will tend to start at a low angle, and then because they're not getting sharp fast, they will rotate up like this in order to get sharp faster. But what actually ends up happening is they end up just dulling the blade, not getting a decent burr. So you just have to keep working at it, keep working at it, keep working at it. And it's a massive pain in the butt, and it takes a long time, but it's worth it. Yeah, no, 2x72s are amazing. Yeah, and 52-100, given its carbidizing of the edge, is definitely a great steel for remove the last grip before proceeding further. Indeed. So yeah, it acts much like it's hand sanding or polishing. You want to completely remove the last grip before moving on to the next one. Each step should be probably a little bit shorter than the next one because it shouldn't take that long. But yeah, at the end of the day, you want to practice the fundamentals on anything, right? Like as I said, I won that competition on Blade Symposium using stuff that they literally dug out of the trash. And I managed to get an edge that would be classified under the best ratings as being a custom knife edge, right? So the BESS is kind of subjective testing apparatus for testing sharpness of blades. It's a pressure sensitive scale underneath 2 little prongs that hold a filament between them, and the blade is rested on a rest and then cuts the filament, and how much pressure it takes to cut the filament gives you a BESS rating. Mine were regularly getting between 250 and 300 BESS, which is around about custom knife sharpness. So, and that was done with some old scrap and a piece of wood with with Satanite rubbed into it. So yeah, hopefully that teaches you some stuff. I'm sorry this went a little bit longer than I expected, but at the end of the day, sharpening is one of those things that I take very seriously. At the same time, I think that there are some people who take it a little bit too over there. But yeah, basically, you can sharpen to a very appreciable degree with a cheap hone like this. I think this cost me like $10, and it's been with me forever. It's all about knowing skill, not tools, right? You can have the best sharpening equipment in the world, you still won't sharpen better than someone who actually knows how to do it. All right, so anyway, with that being said, I'm going to jump off. It's warm, and it's also, I've got to go get some stuff prepared. But yeah, hopefully that helped you. If you have any more questions, feel free to message me on Instagram or Facebook or any of those places, or send me an email at samtownsbladesmith@gmail.com. Make sure to listen to the Forgecast. We've got some really cool stuff coming up for our 100th and 104th episode coming up very soon. I think we're on episode 98. So yeah, we're getting very close. But make sure you're checking that out. Thank you so much to my patrons, and thank you thank you so much to Black Collar Ironworks and Ben Toombs for throwing in super chats today. I really do appreciate that, and everyone who did an auction to help me with my car repairs. You guys are all awesome. I don't understand what I did to deserve it, but I really love all of you, and I can't express it in words that actually make sense. So, with that being said, I'm just going to say thank you. I have another video coming out on Wednesday of the review of my Beamish anvil, with also me preparing the anvil for how I want to use it. And then I've got a whole bunch of other stuff coming as well, along with, as you guys may have seen on my Instagram feed, this project will be coming soon. My patrons will get to see it a few weeks before everyone else. The videos, I'm going to be stacking videos a couple of at a time. So yeah, patrons will get to see me working on this very soon. So yeah, stay tuned. Lots of cool stuff coming. Thank you so much. All right, I'll see you guys later. Have a fantastic week.